know, when people like Masekela or Gwangwa got to the States, they very rapidly became in demand. And given how insular and inward-looking the American music scene is, that tells you that what they were bringing was quality. It does mean they didn't get perhaps as much publicity, and particularly in Gwangwa's case, as much publicity as their work merited, but they were in demand as arrangers, as composers, as sidemen, as producers for other people's music. When Miriam Makeba played New York nightclubs, people were wowed. When Ndiko Kaba went to Chicago and actually joined the free music scene there, people were willing to give him like center stage space because he was such an interesting musician. So no, it wasn't just about politics, and in fact I think we overestimate the extent to which the Western world was interested in our struggles at that time. They actually weren't as interested as they should have been. And some of them were colluding with the regime. So it wasn't all, oh, you know, poor South Africans who are struggling, let's support them. There was damn good music being made, and that was recognized, and it did get some international showcasing. If you listen to the kinds of musics that, although he's not a South African working in South Africa, Salim Washington is making, which actually are commentary on our political events. But I think there is now space, because there isn't that single overwhelming narrative, to talk about other matters again. I mean, if you talk to the trumpeter Mandla Mlangeni, he will tell you that his music is still political with a small p, in that he's talking about possibilities for personal liberation, the extension of, you know, being yourself, realizing yourself in a free society. It's not the kind of hard politics that his parents' generation were working with. It's still not unpolitical. If you listen to what Steve Dyer's doing, with a great deal of work around the need to recognize our common humanity and fight against xenophobia, there's still a narrative there. But I think what we've got now is a much richer mixing of personal narratives along with the narratives of the struggles we face, the task of decolonization, which we still is as big now as it was then, quite frankly, the task of creating a fairer and more human society. I think all of those things are in there. Hearing Zim Ngqawana, hearing Zim doing stuff with traditional Xhosa roots was very much almost a moment in parallel with the one that happened back in the 70s when the Cold Castle Jazz Festival actually heard Eric Nomvete creating new jazz out of Xhosa roots. You know? So there are those kinds of moments. There are individual musicians who you just hear them and, you know, your mouth falls open and you think, this is a new voice. And Taiwo was definitely one of those, as was Zim. There are places, the old bass line, for example, where you suddenly realized that there was an audience and a set of music makers who were interested in trying to do something new and creative and innovative. And I'm thinking particularly of the band Voice with Andile Yanana and Marcus Wyatt, Morabo Morojele, Sidney Mnise, those musicians. Even before the old bass line, a club called Softtown that now no longer exists, which was the first post-liberation to have big, very open jam sessions. And of course, while we're talking about all this, we also have to talk about the work of people who are never really associated with a stage or a club, like the late Peter Makurube and the Monday Blues session, which was actually one of those places where things like the fusions of different kinds of music began happening, where music and poetry started talking to one another. So I can't pick out a moment, but I think our jazz history has lots of those kinds of moments. Think about the life of any person in a black community under apartheid. You had no security, you didn't know from one day to the next whether you were going to be removed, whether the need to find a job was going to drag you from one place to another. So people quite simply lost the things that normally a family would keep in an attic or somewhere. If you didn't have that kind of stability in your life, those things didn't get kept. And remember, a lot of records were made of shellac. They just broke when the Boer were throwing things onto vans and things like that. So the fact that it's data poor then, I think, is a direct consequence of apartheid. And in fact, when you go back and talk to musicians of those generations now, they have huge numbers of memories. And it's just somehow, You know, the media was segregated, everything was segregated. There were very few people with the luxury to work as historians. And apartheid music history concentrated on traditional music through a white lens and white music. So what's more worrying to me, and I've just been doing a couple of jobs that have involved me in researching, is the fact that media coverage of South African musics, and I don't just mean jazz, are shrinking and being degraded now. If you try and find, you know, when the late Peter Ntwane died, I looked everywhere for a biography. There is not a decent biography of Peter Ntwane anywhere. When Pinisa Saul and Lucky Ranku passed away, one South African newspaper, the Daily Sun, printed an obituary. Nobody else even bothered, had the respect to do research to write something about them. So I'm not so worried about the past because I think we can explain that. And we've lost an awful lot and I think it's tragic, but there's not much we can do about it. I'm really worried about the present. Because when the next generation of music writers to come to look back, what are they going to find? Newspapers that write about, you know, Boiti Tulo's high heels. Jazz is and was and always will be a niche music. In South Africa, we face the situation that because our population is smaller than, say, America, our niches are also smaller. And I'm really actually tired of having this argument. If you want to run a festival on the scale of Cape Town or Joy of Jazz, it cannot be a jazz-only festival. You wouldn't get 37,000 people. You wouldn't put 68 million back into the Cape Town city economy. You wouldn't be able to do any of those things. So if you want to operate on that scale, and if you cast your eyes around the world, it's true of Montreux, it's true of Newport, it's true of any jazz festival. You can't do it on jazz alone. What those other artists and other genres do, they do two quite nice things. Firstly, they create the economic cushion on which the jazz events at those festivals can happen. You know, you can go to Cape Town and spend your entire time between Rosie's and the Moses Mololekwa room. You don't have to hear a single thing that isn't jazz. You'll have a fabulous weekend. But it wouldn't be possible if those other musics weren't going on and providing an income cushion around it. The business model simply would not work. But the other nice thing that non-jazz musics at these big festivals do is they do create the opportunities for collaboration. And I think perhaps sometimes that's not used as much as it could be, but it's there. And they create the chance for audiences to drift from, you know, a hip-hop act here to a jazz act there just to sample it. I don't think it's necessarily a negative thing, but I do think something else, which is we shouldn't always be looking at these big festivals. You know, it's very cool to have Joy of Jazz, it's cool to have Cape Town. I would like to see some smaller festivals which could specialize in jazz. Festivals in places of this size of the orbit, you know, 400 people maximum, where you could fill an entire venue for jazz and you could make some really exciting, edgy things happen within jazz. You know, mega is not always best. Mega deals with one kind of audience need, but it's not the only business model that's possible. I refuse to play favorites because jazz isn't a zero-sum game. You know, there isn't a prize for the best and everybody else. It's why I hate things like the Summers, actually, because there's never just one amazing record in a year. There are usually half a dozen or a dozen. If I talk about people whose playing I enjoy, there are a lot of them. Tandian Tuli, I would say, is somebody. Bokani Dyer and Duduzo, Kyle, Cassivan again. You know, you couldn't stop. And I think while we're saying this, let's not also forget some people who've been around for a very long time and don't get the recognition that they merit. For example, Buddy Wells, who's been around for years and is still one of the sweetest sounding saxophonists I can think of. Sidney Mnisi, also of that kind of generation, who doesn't get half the props he deserves. So I think, you know, it's not just about young and up and coming. Obviously, I think at the moment we all have to be listening to Sia Makuzeni, because as a musician, what she's doing is way more creative and imaginative than a lot of other musicians who've occupied her slot. But I don't think it is just the younger people. I think there are still a lot of great music. Oscar Ratchabane. You know, we talk about Barney a lot, and Barney is a brilliant musician who deserves to be talked about. But in his family, there is a young man who doesn't behave like a star, and maybe this is why we don't notice Oscar so much. He's also a superb player. You know, so I think there's too many around really for me to pick. This is a totally random list. just sucked out of the end of my thumb because you asked me the question. But there's a lot more people whose names will get me out of my house in the evenings and coming here to listen to them.